Hi everyone, I'm Barb and I want to show you my favorite way to machine bind a quilt. I don't like to do it by hand. I know many of you really love to do it that way, but I just don't. I like to be able to do it quickly, to be done with my quilt and go on to the next project. So let me show you what I'm going to do. Right here, I have a small little sample of what a quilt might be. So I have it sandwiched together. I've got batting in between and it's all quilted and ready to go. I have my binding, and I like to do my binding at 2.5 inches. Some may want to do 2.25. That all works too. So I've got 2.5 inch binding. I have pressed it in half. And besides that, if I've got a really long binding that I have to do, I will sew it together on the bias. Then I will press them in all one direction. Then I will take my long strip and I will press it in half. So I've got this very long strip of fabric. Okay, I am going to sew it to the back of my quilt because remember, I'm going to machine bind. I want to leave, about this, 6 to 10 inches, just hanging loose and free. I'm not going to sew that down. And it's going to be different on an actual quilt because you'll have more area to work with. I just have this tiny little sample, so I'm going to smidge just a little bit. I'm going to start sewing right here, and I'm going to sew all the way around, putting that on my quilt here. And I am going to sew it at 1/4 inch on this edge. So let's go over to the machine and we'll do that first. I have my needle in my right hand needle position, and I'm just going to follow along the edge of my foot. And when I get to the corner, I'll show you what I do. So I sew to about 1/4 inch from the corner, give or take. I'll cut my threads, pull it out, and then I want to fold that up so that this edge is straight with my binding edge. Then I will fold this back down so those edges up there are even. And you'll notice that my inside is tucked nicely inside. Then I will start sewing right from the edge. And I'll keep on sewing. And I'll do that on each corner. So let me do it again for you. Cut my threads, and then I'm going to fold this up so that those edges are straight right along there. Then I will fold this back down. And I want this edge up here to be straight. Do you see how now I've got a flush there and I've got it flush up there? And I'm just going to start off the fabric and sew down. And I'm going to keep my binding tight against my fabric. I don't want any waves in it. Now, when you do these corners a few times, you won't have to fold it up and then fold it back down again. Cut my threads. You can simply take it and fold it like that. So you don't have to go through that process each time. Once you get used to it and you know what you're doing, you'll be doing it in your sleep. So there I go. And that that miters that corner really nicely, you'll see. Now, I'm not going to sew very far because, like I say, I have a very small quilt sandwich here. So I'm going to, now I've got this. So there's the edge that I don't have done. But notice how each of my corners have been folded over just like that. They're all going to be just the same. So all of my mitered corners are going to be going the same direction. That's the beauty of this. All right, now I'm going to trim off because I don't need all of that binding. In fact, I'm going to take off a little bit more. And this is going to be a little squishy because I am on just a little teeny sample here. So what I want to do is that I'm going to pull this, kind of tug, not too tight. I don't want to stretch it, but I want to have that laying flat. Now that's the one I cut off. That's where I started. Then I'm going to pull this one over. This is the one I want to join to this one, but I want to pull it over the top, and I'm going to, once again, I'm just going to make that, oh, whoops, forgot a step. Let's go back. So I've got this one right here. This is the piece I cut off. Now it won't matter if you're doing 2.5 inches, 2.25 inches, it really won't matter. It's all going to be the same. I'm going to take the piece I cut off, measure over, put a pin right there, because I want my binding edges to overlap that far. So I'm going to take this one, and I'm not going to pull it. I'm not going to stretch it, but I'm going to have that pretty snug. And I like to use just a pencil because it's not going to show. I'm going to mark where that pin was. Let me tell you again what I've done. I've got this back part. This is the one I started with that I left kind of flapped open. And I set it down and I pinned it to keep it nice and tight. I took the piece off that I cut. I lined it up there, the width of the piece I cut off. So it's always going to be the same width all the way around. It's going to be 2.5 for me. So I have measured over 2.5 inches. I have put a pin in there. I'm going to take that one out because I don't need it there anymore. This is the one that's important to me because I want these two binding edges to overlap exactly the width of the binding. No matter what size binding you're using, you want them to overlap exactly the width. So there I have it. I've got this pin in marking the width, and I've marked it with a little pencil mark right there. Now I can take this pin out, and I'm going to cut right on there. And sometimes if you've got this big, beautiful quilt you've worked on for so long, cutting that part can be a little scary. But don't be afraid. Going to do it. All right, so I have these two overlapping. It doesn't matter which is on top. It doesn't matter right now. But I'm going to take one in my left hand. I'm going to put my fingers inside, and one in my right hand. My fingers are inside, and I'm going to overlap my right over left like this. I'm going to do that again. Okay, I have my binding right there. I'm going to put my fingers inside of each of my binding pieces like this. So I've got a hold of them like this. See? Now I'm going to take the right one and overlap it onto the left. And I'm going to put a pin in right like that. I'm going to put a pin in here. Now, the reason I'm putting 2 pins like that in is because that will help me remember that I want to sew from that corner down to this corner. So you can see underneath there, I have the other binding piece. I'm going to sew from this corner down to that corner. All right. Now, if I want to, I can mark this, and maybe, see this corner down here, I really can't see very well. Maybe I'll put a little mark right there so I can have somewhere to shoot to. So I'm going to I'm going to sew from there to there. Okay, let's go over and sew that now. And I've got to remember to put my needle back in the center needle position because I want to sew right exactly where I'm looking. So I'm going to start at this corner up here. If I had it in my right needle position, then it would just sew off center, and I don't want that. And I've got my marking down here, so I know where I'm headed. All right, so I have sewn. There's my 2 pins, and I sewed between them. Let's take those out. Now you can see on this side, I have sewn from that corner to that corner. This side, that corner to that corner, same thing. So it's going to work. But if I want to double check my work, let me open that up and say, hey, yeah, that worked out just great. I sewed it from the right corner to the right corner. And if you look at this, I put my pins in this direction. If I had sewn it this direction, that would not have worked. When I opened it like this, it would be all skewampus. You don't want that. All right, once I'm sure that I like how it is, then I'm going to trim this off because I don't need that anymore. All right, now I would go over to my iron. I would press that seam so it was nice and flat. And then I would press this so it's nice and flat. I'm not going to for the demo purposes here. And I'm just going to go back to my machine, put my needle in 1/4 inch in my right hand needle position, which is my 1/4 inch, and I'm going to sew that down. And at this point, I'm just going to sew it right down in my right hand needle position. I'm going to follow the edge of my foot. I'm going to use my stiletto. If anywhere in there I have any loose fabric, I'm going to hold it down with my stiletto. This is the byAnnie stiletto, which I love. Okay. Now I have this all sewn down. It is ready to go. Right like that. It is ready to go. Okay, the next thing I want to do is that I want to flip it to the front. And I want to stitch that down. Now, the thing I'm going to use today is that I'm going to use my quilt binding foot, and that is this foot right here. It doesn't come with your machine. It's one that you'll have to buy separate. It doesn't even come in the kits yet. It might later. But what it has is it has a little ridge on the foot. You can see it right there. And if you have one in front of you, you could definitely feel it. See, there's a little ridge right there. The smaller part is a ridge. That means when I put it on my machine and I put my fold up here, that ridge is going to ride right along that fold and keep that nice and straight, and you'll have a beautiful top stitch. So let's go to the machine and let's do that now. One of the things I'm going to change is that I'm going to switch my bobbin thread out from my colored thread, and I am going to put invisible thread in there. And it's so invisible I can barely see it. Come on, thread, get in there. All right, and the reason I'm going to do that is because on the back of the fabric, I really can't tell where I'm stitching because it is invisible. But if I have that red thread in there or the green or whatever I'm using, then it's definitely going to show on the back. And I really don't want that to show. All right, here I go. I've got my foot on. This is my quilt binding foot. My ridge on my quilt binding foot is to the left. I'm going to have my whole quilt hanging out here, so it's not going to be in my way. And I'm going to line that fold up with the ridge on my foot. I'm going to put my needle back in center needle position. That's going to give me a perfect top stitch. And I'm going to top stitch that down. And you know, you can go pretty fast because it does exactly what it's supposed to do, holding that fabric in place. And when I get to the corner, I'll show you how I do those corners. I'm going to fold this up as if I were turning the corner and take my byAnnie stiletto, and I am going to run it right along like this. And that will give me a perfect mitered edge right there. Now you don't want to really start maneuvering this corner till you get almost to the corner. And see how that quilt binding foot just kind of goes right up. It's got that smooth edge on it. It's pretty wonderful. Now I can turn it and go the other direction. I don't have to make any adjustments. Now when I get close to the other corner, I'm going to stop, fold this up and over, run my stiletto right along this edge, hold it down with my stiletto. Now I turn it. I'm going to go the other direction. Now, if ever in here I get a puckering or sometimes the bindings are just stretchy and you don't want them to, but sometimes they are. You can use your stiletto to kind of control those fabrics. I do want to make sure that I've got that pulled tight on the back so I don't have a ripple in the front. All right, when I get close to the edge, about that far, I'm going to pull this up and over, get my stiletto, and lay it down. It's really that easy. And here I'm back to where I started, but I'm still going to go close to the edge. Close to that corner. I'm going to lay that over, get my stiletto, roll it down, hang on to it. And it is really that easy. There I go. It's done. My little quilt sandwich is done. And if you were doing a big quilt, I can usually, even including cutting my binding, I can usually have a queen size quilt or bound in about an hour. And that includes cutting my binding apart and sewing it together and ironing it. But look at that. Look at that. Let me see if I can show you those corners. See, there is the back. See how perfect that is? And you cannot see my stitching on the back. I have used invisible thread. And even if you can see the stitching, you're not really going to see it. You're going to see piercings, but you're not going to see the stitching. If you were using a bright thread or even a white thread, it would show up still. And here is the front. Look at that perfect mitered corner. Is that great? Okay, everybody, now's the time to go finish all those quilts you've got sitting on the shelf because you don't want to bind them, because now you can. You can bind them. Okay, thank you, everybody, and thanks for watching, and like my page, and I will love you back. Okay, thank you.